I can see the numbers creeping up here. So what I'm going to do is we'll give a start with the introductions that we have here and talk a little bit about our environmental committee. So carrying on with the TCA's Pathway to Sustainability webinar series, we bring you an update of the City of Toronto's plan to reduce greenhouse gas through its Transform TO program. In line with the city's multi-pronged approach, members from the new development and existing buildings team are here to inform us of the policies currently in place, what's in the pipes, and what we can expect to see the policies, or when we can expect to see the policies evolve. Additionally, they'll address available support and financial incentives. Most importantly, we're meeting a couple of key individuals from the City of Toronto who are here to help, particularly if you have any questions about navigating through the City of Toronto sites. There's an incredible amount of information there. These are the gentlemen that can help you firsthand. Today, our distinguished visitors include two program managers from the city's Environmental and Climate Division, with Zandona addressing new development projects and Duncan MacLellan addressing existing building projects in Toronto. For the past 5.5 years, ZAC has been focused on decarbonizing new development through the implementation of the Toronto Green Standard energy and emission requirements. With almost 15 years working in the energy and climate field, prior to joining the City of Toronto, Duncan previously worked for both utility providers and private contractors, examining the energy use in buildings. Currently, he's responsible for channel partners, new opportunities, and external relations for all existing building programs. We encourage our viewers to submit questions to the panelists by adding them to the Q&A box, with the questions being addressed at the end of the session. Zach, I turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Sandra. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for having me. I'll just share my screen. All right, how does that look? Can everyone see that?
There we go.
All right, so yeah, today I'll be going through the Toronto Green Standard, which is Toronto's green development standards for new developments. My team is responsible for the implementation of the energy and emissions requirements associated with the Toronto Green Standard. So we review energy modeling reports and life cycle assessments, which I'll get into on behalf of City Planning. City Planning owns the whole policy, and we just help out with implementation. So I'll get started with some background as to kind of why we have the Toronto Green Standard, and that's because of Transform TO. So Transform TO is Toronto's climate action plan. It's our strategy to reduce local greenhouse gas emissions, improve our health, grow our economy, improve social equity, and increase climate resilience. And then the main piece of Transform TO and the main mandate of it is to make Toronto a net zero emissions city by 2040. And so the way that my team does that is through the implementation of the Toronto Green Standard energy and emissions requirements, amongst some other things, but that's one of the main things, main drivers of emission reductions for our team. So some more information on the Toronto Green Standard. So like I said before, it's Toronto's Green Development Standards that applies to all new developments that are going through the city's application process. Or the city's planning application process, and the Toronto Green Standard applies at site plan application. So we get a site plan application. If it meets a certain threshold, the Toronto Green Standard applies, and then they have to meet all these different requirements related to sustainability. And so there's requirements around air quality. We have building energy and emissions requirements, which is what we are responsible for implementing. And then there's other requirements related to water quality, ecology, and waste and circular economy, which other neighboring divisions are responsible for reviewing and implementing. So to get into more of what the Toronto Green Standard is and how it's set up, is it's a tiered standard that gets more stringent every 4 years and provides a pathway to move from the current Toronto Green Standard mandatory requirement to the voluntary requirements that will soon become mandatory, which would lead to a near zero emissions requirement for all buildings that are subject to the Toronto Green Standard. So as I said, it's a tiered system. So back in 2018, we were in version 3 of the Toronto Green Standard, which had 4 different tiers. Tier 1 being mandatory, and tiers 2 to 4 being voluntary, and tier 4 being a near zero emission building. So the idea is every 4 years, the minimum requirements get more stringent. So as you can see here in 2022, May of 2022, we arrived at version 4 of the Toronto Green Standard, where the first voluntary tier from 2018 became the mandatory tier in 2022. So all that to say, we're moving towards an environment where buildings are required to be net zero emissions by 2030. And along with each tier, we have specific energy requirements. And they are energy use intensity. So that describes the energy being used by a specific building. There is thermal energy use intensity, which describes the performance of the building envelope. So we have a target around that. And then we have greenhouse gas emission intensity, which describes the building's operational emissions in 1 year. So we have targets for each of these 3 metrics, and each tier has a number for each of these metrics. So back in 2021, the city declared a climate emergency. And as part of that, they directed us to accelerate those greenhouse gas intensity targets that I just spoke about. They directed us to accelerate them by 1 year. So as you can see, I had this chart here, but we're in version 4 right now. And then in 2026 is when version 5 is going to come into effect. And then 2030 is when version 6 is supposed to be coming into effect. But City Council directed us to explore accelerating just the greenhouse gas intensity compared to when versions 5 and 6 were supposed to come into effect. So in 2025, next year, we may be moving on to the version 5 greenhouse gas intensity, as opposed to waiting till 2026 to do it, to further drive emissions down quicker as a result of this climate emergency declaration. And then we're also directed to look at accelerating the version 6 greenhouse gas intensity to 2028 instead of 2030. And all that to say, the rest of the targets would come into effect as planned. So the energy use intensity and the thermal energy demand intensity would come into effect in 2026 as planned for version 5, and 2030 as planned for version 6. And we're reporting to council next month, I believe. And we're going to propose accelerating the greenhouse gas intensity, so nothing's for sure yet, but that's what we're going to propose. And if council goes through with it, you'll see a greenhouse gas intensity acceleration probably in July of next year. So there is an incentive for reaching the voluntary tiers of the Toronto Green Standard, and that is a partial development charge refund. So if you're going above and beyond the minimum, so not tier 1, but tiers 2 or 3 at the moment, then you could be subject to the development charge refund, which ends up being approximately 7 to 8% of development charges refunded to your project, as long as you can prove that you've met the requirements of the Toronto Green Standard voluntary tiers. We haven't seen much uptake in it, to be honest, especially with version 4. It's not typically enough of an incentive for developers to just go and do this without having their own climate goals and actions. So usually that's kind of the driver for developers to go for the voluntary tiers. So I'll just get into the different energy standards as part of the Toronto Green Standard for different archetypes, for different common archetypes in the city. So we have energy requirements around low-rise Part 9 residential, so townhouses fewer than 4 stories with a minimum of 10 dwelling units. And then we have other requirements for mid to high-rise residential and all non-rise residential Part 3 buildings. And then we have a separate standard for our own buildings, our city agency, corporation, and division facilities. So for Part 9 buildings, so townhouses, Tier 1 must follow Energy Star or R2000 compliance options as per the energy efficiency design summary form that you see right here. And then if a Part 9 building is going for the Tier 2 requirements, they must design and construct the building in accordance with the CHBA Net Zero Home Labeling Program or Passive House Standard. And then we don't have a Tier 3 requirement for low-rise. So this slide shows the requirements for most buildings that we see in the city of Toronto. So like I said, we have energy use intensity, thermal energy demand intensity, and greenhouse gas intensities for each tier, okay? And we also have those requirements for different buildings. So different building archetypes have different targets because there are different uses, different loads. Buildings are operating at different times of day. So different kinds of buildings have different requirements. So we have a set of requirements for multi-unit residential buildings that are greater than 4 stories, and then multi-unit residential buildings that are less than 4 stories. And then there are separate targets for commercial office, commercial retail, mixed use, and then all other types. So basically, you don't really have to know exactly what these numbers mean. Just know that there are targets as part of each tier for each different archetype. And in order to show compliance with these targets, energy modeling reports and energy models are submitted to us that show how the building is going to perform. And so we review those models in detail and send comments back and forth with the planners and the applicants to ensure that they're meeting our requirements. So here's the city building requirement. So the city is known to lead by examples. So as we move towards 2028 or 2020 or 2030, where buildings are going to be required to be near zero operational emissions, we like to lead by example. And so we have a requirement right now for all city buildings to achieve a greenhouse gas intensity of 0. So we're building net zero now just to show that it is possible and give the industry comfort that there are solutions. And so with that greenhouse gas intensity of 0, one of the following below has to be met. So they could either show a minimum energy use intensity of 100 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year and a thermal energy demand intensity of 30 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, or they can show that they are performing 50% better than an Ontario Building Code compliant building through an energy model, or they can achieve passive house levels of performance, so achieve passive house certification, or they could get certification for the Canada Green Building Council Zero Carbon Building Design Standard. That is also another compliance option that is acceptable for city buildings. So as of about a year and a half ago, we introduced embodied carbon requirements as part of the Toronto Green Standard as well. They are largely voluntary at the moment. So for privately owned buildings, there are only targets for tiers 2 and 3. There is no tier 1 mandatory target at the moment, but there is a mandatory target for city-owned buildings. So our targets are based on, so in order to meet our targets, we have to applicants have to provide a life cycle assessment for life cycle stages A1 to A5 of a building's life. So those stages include raw material extraction to transportation to a manufacturing facility that manufactures the material, and then transportation of that material to the construction site, and then emissions associated with the construction and the installation of that material. So life cycle analysis has to include all materials that are used for the structure and envelope, and the life cycle stages A1 to A5 that I just described. So the mandatory city-owned target and the tier 2 privately owned building target for embodied carbon is 350 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for residential and commercial buildings, and 400 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for other building types. And then we have a target as well for the low-rise Part 9 buildings, and that is 250 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. And then there is a tier 3 target as well for privately owned buildings, and a voluntary target for city-owned buildings, and those targets are 250 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for residential and commercial buildings, and 275 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for other building types. So I have some common solutions in order to meet some of the tiers of the Toronto Green Standard for typical buildings that we see in Toronto, or most of the applications that we get are mid to high-rise multi-unit residential buildings. So a typical design package that you would see to meet our current minimum requirements, which is tier 1. So on the mechanical side, ground or air source heat pumps for space heating and cooling are very typical. It's not necessarily required, but we do see a lot of ground and air source heat pumps for space heating and cooling. And then a gas boiler for domestic hot water is sufficient usually for tier 1. And then when it comes to the envelope, aluminum window walls with about an R10 usually suffice. And then double glazed windows, a 40% window to wall ratio, and thermally broken balconies will get you to that tier 1 for a multi-unit residential building. Oops. Sorry, I just went too far. Okay, and here is a typical tier 2 design package for a multi-unit residential building. So on the mechanical side, it's almost definite that you will need to electrify your space heating and cooling. So a ground source heat pump for space heating and cooling, or an air source heat pump if it works for the project. And then usually you'd also have to electrify your domestic hot water. So using something like an electric boiler or a CO2 heat pump. And then on the envelope side, 8.5 mineral wool insulation with insulated stud wall R19 insulation or walls would usually suffice for an envelope for tier 2. And then triple glazed windows like the tier 1, 40% window to wall ratio, and thermally broken balconies would typically get you to a tier 2 building. Now, I don't have a design package for tier 3 because we haven't seen a tier 3 mid to high-rise multi-unit residential building yet, but just know that all domestic hot water, all space heating, cooling needs to be electrified for that kind of building, and you need to have a really, really high-performing envelope with reduced thermal bridging and all that kind of stuff that contributes to a good envelope. And then some best practices to reduce embodied carbon in order to meet our voluntary embodied carbon targets if you're a private building, or mandatory embodied carbon targets if it's a city building. So you can first ask suppliers for low carbon options for materials and focus on high volume materials, that make up the structure and envelope. So concrete and steel are definitely the highest emitting materials that we use for construction today. So figuring out where the low carbon options are for those materials is a great start. And then you can use less materials by avoiding things like transfer slabs, which reduces the requirement which reduces the need for as much concrete. And then you can also use less materials by reducing step backs and below grade construction. A lot of concrete goes into underground parking garages. So if you reduce those parking levels, you can find great reductions in embodied carbon. And then you can use less materials by avoiding using all new materials. So if you have something existing on site, if you can reuse anything that is already there, that's always a good option as well, if possible. When it comes to concrete specifically, you can explore concrete mixes that use as little cement as possible. Cement is the component of concrete that is the most carbon intensive. So if you can use concrete with more slag, for example, that reduces the need for cement, which reduces embodied carbon. And then when it comes to steel, you can ask for a North American steel, so local steel with high recycled content. And wood structures are generally less carbon intensive than steel. So mass timber up to a certain point makes sense. So like about mid-rise 10 stories, that could greatly reduce your embodied carbon. And then you can create a low carbon construction site. So use electric construction equipment wherever possible. And then also using biofuel is a good solution to reduce embodied carbon or reduce construction emissions. That's it from me. On the new development side, I'll hand it over to my colleague Duncan, who will be going over the existing buildings policies that we have at the city.
Thank you, Zach. That was fantastic. I can imagine many, many questions that will arise out of this that even today people won't be able to wrap their mind around, but know that this will be posted. So we'll talk about that later. Duncan?
Well, good morning. Thank you, Sandra, and thanks, Zach, for kicking us off there. Really, how we were trying to do this is, hey, new construction and then move into the existing buildings. So my name's Duncan. I'm a project manager with the City of Toronto. My role is mainly to reach out to all of our channel partners and the industry to have connections with them and make presentations and make sure everybody knows what's going on at the City of Toronto. So a little bit of background. I know Zach talked a little bit about Transform TO. I'm just going to look at where our emissions in the city come from right now. So right now, the City of Toronto has quite a large portion in buildings, which I mean is very is very important to this industry. But it gives us quite a large opportunity to reduce some of those emissions, and we'll send this around after for everybody. I just put all the interesting details on the side so that we can so that you will get it afterwards. So when we're talking about emissions in buildings, we're looking at what's residential, what's commercial, what's industrial, how does that work? So, and where do those come from? And mostly in Ontario, because of our clean grid, it comes from natural gas. There's small amounts of emissions that are based on electricity, but most of it comes from natural gas. So when we were putting together Transform TO, we had our new development group talk about how to reduce emissions in new buildings. Then we said we got to do existing buildings at the same time, because if you have a new building, how are you going to look at the whole kind of life cycle of this building and most buildings in Toronto already exist. So we put together a strategy that came out with 9 recommended actions for existing buildings, and I kind of split them up into 3 different portions. Right here I have I'll have the link to the entire report, and then also there's a 1-page summary, which a lot of people like reading that 1-page summary, but it's about a 75-page report, and it came to 3 sets of actions of 3. The first one we like to call sticks. It's policy based, it's mandatory pieces, it's mandatory reporting, it's emissions performance targets, and other mandatory pieces. The second piece is support pieces. How do we support the industry with the necessary items to prop them up, whether it be financing, whether it be technical support, all of those. And then the third piece is I like to call it a microphone. I don't know if that's the perfect word for it, but it's advocacy to different different governments. It's supporting the workforce development, and it's education of the industry and everyone all around. It's where we end up talking with people the most. So our first piece has come down, and it actually it's 8 days until the reporting is due for our first bylaw. So we have an energy and water reporting bylaw where all existing buildings over 50,000 square feet have to report their energy and water usage to the city. The province already requires this for 50,000 square feet and above. We have made sure that it's the exact same reporting tool. So if you're reporting to the province, you also report to the city. It's less than 10 clicks. Less than 10 additional clicks on the reporting tool. So that was really important when we were developing this bylaw, to make sure that people didn't have to enter their information in 15 different places all the time. The reason why the province is, there are legal reasons why the province cannot just pass that information over to us. We're still working with them to see what can be done, but at this point, that's the reason why they can't just give us the information. That's a question we generally get about that. So who needs to report and when do they need to report? The province has a whole bunch of exemptions based on different building types. We don't really have those exemptions in the city of Toronto. And next year we are looking to take the reporting requirements down to 10,000 square feet, which would drastically bump up the number of buildings that need to report. You can see these are approximate numbers here. So where do we go from that? Why are we doing reporting? Why do we have mandatory reporting? How does that help us? Well, when doing a jurisdictional scan, we found that building performance standards, building emission performance standards, BEPS as it's called kind of in a lot of places, is one of the best ways to improve and really make impact on a scale for emission reductions. And to have relevant numbers to figure out how we set our building performance standards, where we set those limits, we need to figure out what buildings in the city of Toronto are using on a building per building basis. So as we get that information in, as we get that reporting in, we will use those to inform our building emissions performance standards. People then ask me the next question, which is, when is this coming? So the next step is staff is proposing. So there's a bunch of pieces that I'll show you in a few minutes, but staff is proposing a bylaw on emission performance standards to council in Q3 of 2025. And we're learning from a whole bunch of different jurisdictions that are already doing these in North America. They're doing it worldwide as well, but the most relevant to us is who's doing it in North America and what are they doing. So to give you an idea that Toronto is not doing this in isolation, Vancouver and Montreal have very similar timeframes, if not almost exactly the same timeframes for us for building performance standards and for reporting as well. And here's a huge map of North America on who's already passed building performance standards and who has committed to passing those. So you're looking at kind of most of the big cities across America, mostly, and they've already passed some of these things. Some of these states have already passed it as well. So those are some key items that we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're not doing this where nobody else is. We're making sure that we are aligned with some of the other large cities in North America that we need to, number one, compete with, but also number two, have the same goals. This is what I was talking about before in terms of engagement. As we're going through the bylaw, we are doing lots and lots and lots of different engagements. One of them, so the Toronto Construction Association is on our list for engagement, and we go back and forth with the team there. They are on some committees, and what we do is we look at the technical side, we look at the legal side, we look at all the different pieces, and then when we go out to the market, how do we create some of those supporting structures and programs and resources that are around them? Because to be totally honest, all the contractors across the city are our partners in implementation. All the work is going to be done by building contractors, being done by HVAC contractors. It's being done by all the people who will be doing the work across the city. And building knowledge and capacity within the industry is some of the huge pieces that we're looking to do, and making sure that we have demonstrative projects. We're working, there's a couple of pieces later that I'll show you, but we're working to build some of the resources to demonstrate and have these huge case studies to show it can be done in the city. It is being done in the city, and here's how you do it. So in terms of our programs, how we support, we've kind of broken them up into a couple of areas. We've got our support guidance, we've got our financial incentives, and we've got different policy pieces. So policy is kind of the stick piece, and the finance and support and engage guidance pieces are the support sections. So our main catch-all one is our navigation support services. This is really where a building comes to us and says, hey, I don't know where to start. Where do I go? And we'll help send you resources. We say, what type of building are you? Here's what's available, whether it's provincial, whether it's federal, whether it's municipal. We give all of the different incentive programs, financing programs, technical support programs, kind of all of them are in one location. You just kind of you fill out what type of building you are and send it through. The Green Will Initiative is another one that we work with. They're some of the largest building owners in the city, and the key part about this one is we want to collaborate and we want to build those resources together. So for example, Oxford Properties, your Brookfield, Starlight, Dream, they're all in this Green Will Initiative, and we're working together to share best practices, show different projects, and then also create a resource database so that everybody can share and learn from it. We also want to recognize some of the organizations that are doing great work. So if you're doing great work with one of these organizations and you want to highlight some of it, this is a great avenue that we could do and show the rest of the city. We have a loan program, which is pretty, it's a pass-through cost of the city's cost of borrowing, but it is mainly focused on low carbon. So if you want to, if you're interested in seeing if the city can be your borrower for the loan program, you can check that out, but it is a low carbon requirement for these loans. And one of the example projects that we were talking about, where how do we create some of these examples? How do we create some of these case studies to show what's happening in the city of Toronto? We're in the middle of a program called the Deep Retrofit Challenge, where we've gotten funding from Natural Resources Canada to develop a whole bunch of different projects that go super deep on the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a minimum of 50% reduction in your total energy use intensity. Most of these buildings are going for 70 or 80% reduction, and we're giving them some money to do that top up on top of it. If you're doing projects on the residential side, we have a home energy loan program that homeowners can borrow, and it goes right on their taxes. So the repayment stays with the house. And then we also have information for low-rise building. As Zach was talking about, there are differences for low rises and high-rise buildings, and we have some low-rise resources, as well as if we go into the high-rise, we have our Sustainable Towers program, our STEP program, which goes through and does a free audit of the building on a couple different levels, everything from security to community engagement to energy. They also have their own financing program as well, so we can tap into that. And then kind of lastly, we have green roof programs as well. So if you're building, some of the requirements for Toronto Green Standard need some of these, but there are also, you can create green roofs and there is incentives for that as well. And they've been quite successful over the last few years. And finally, I put together kind of everything on a links and resource page at the end of here so that when this is sent out by the TCA, everybody can just click on some links. Sandra, that's it from my angle. Thank you very much for letting me chat. I know lots of people have lots of things that they could be doing with their time, so thanks for spending it with us.
Okay, so looking at the questions, the first question, Zach, I see that you've got something addressed. The question said, you mentioned the energy model was required. Will cities select any building to audit energy usage after building occupied?
Yeah, I answered there in the chat. We don't currently verify tier 1 buildings after occupation. We don't have the authority to. So we realize that there's definitely a gap in performance between what is modeled at site plan application when we review these, and then compared to what it actually gets built. So as part of some of the future versions of the Toronto Green Standard, we're exploring how we might be able to go about verifying tier 1 buildings. Might have to be tied to an incentive or something like that. But we do realize that there's a gap, and we're trying to do something about it. And then just a note on all tier 2 and above buildings, we do verify those. They have to be verified in order for us to give them the development charge refund.
And additionally, I would like to say the kind of back end of that is as we put in existing building mandates and bylaws and policies, the backstop will be the existing ones as well. So once it's built, it becomes an existing building. So it has to abide by the bylaws and policies that are on the existing buildings team. So as we catch up, we are catching up on that side on the existing building. But as we catch up, it will be right in line with what Zach was talking about.
So the next question, for buildings, if we want to reduce below grade construction, what would be a possible alternative for parking and stormwater storage?
Yeah, so Toronto doesn't have minimum parking requirements, so you don't really need an alternative for parking. When it comes to stormwater, you start with reducing volumes through something like green roof or permeable pavers, landscaping options that will reduce the need for a lot of space for stormwater storage. But as for alternatives, if you still do need storage, I'm not really an expert on that, to be honest. So I can't really speak to alternatives to that.
Okay. Here we have a comment rather than a question, so you may have something to add to it. But in my opinion, the recommendations for the structural steel should be simply GWP performance based and should not be prescriptive to geography and recycled content. Recycled content is a roundabout way of trying to push steel towards EAF without actually prescribing it, but the GWP values account for this inherently. The issues with recycled content is that each mill varies and designers can drastically reduce mills that can be sourced from it if they pick a recycled content threshold that is too high. In general, be performance-based and not prescriptive. Is this something that you're taking into consideration?
Yeah, so those were just suggestions to meet our embodied carbon targets. So our embodied carbon target includes all materials that go into the structural envelope. Designers can go in and choose to reduce from just concrete and meet our embodied carbon target, or they can go in and reduce just from steel. So we're not really prescriptive at all. We give all these different options to reduce embodied carbon based on the envelope and the structure, and how they do that to meet our target is up to them. So we can't really be prescriptive about a GWP for steel because our target is based on all the materials that go into the structure.
So I think, the key here is as we move towards net zero, we're finding that sources are being reduced, historically used sources, in order to move forward. Is that something that's considered by the City of Toronto?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
That our sources are being reduced in order to use materials that are meeting the requirements. Some sources that have been historically used are no longer sufficient. They're not going to meet the targets. This is changing our industry.
We're signaling that to the industry, although since the embodied carbon targets are largely voluntary at the moment, they're only mandatory for city buildings. There's no difference. Most buildings right now are meeting the tier 1, so they're still using the conventional materials that have been used for a while.
Yeah, certainly one of the things that I have noted is that a number of the manufacturers are very aggressively working towards these new requirements. They may not have met milestones, and they're developing and learning, experiencing costs through that lesson process, which hopefully when volume starts moving up, then the costs will come down.
Exactly. And there could be a situation where the Toronto Green Standard introduces mandatory embodied carbon targets for all Toronto Green Standard projects. Not for sure, but given the way that our operational requirements have come into effect over time and become more stringent, it's likely that at some point mandatory embodied carbon targets come into.
Okay. Another question here regarding the BEPS. Can the city not obtain energy use records from the utilities directly, or get energy regulators to allow that transfer of information to reduce the administrative burden on the individual landowners?
So we are working on that. That is something that we would love. We're talking with Toronto Hydro and the regulation that is around what they have to be able to get their information. Even internally, just the separation between different divisions in the city. There are privacy protections for Toronto Water, between water and us. And then Enbridge will be a little bit of a different beast because of the way that the gas industry is structured. But yes, we are working on that. That is something that we would love. We would love kind of like a one touch, just get it from everybody all at once. But at this exact moment, there are legal barriers around that. So we're doing what we can and trying to reduce the burden as much as we can by making sure we have it in the same place. We're asking for the same items as the provincial requirements, all those different pieces. But yes, you are right. That's something that we are working towards, and hopefully we can get to that sooner rather than later.
Now, another question or comment. For concrete, I would modify the phrase to use as much supplementary cementitious material as possible. But the designers need to be careful to work with suppliers to ensure these materials can be used in association or in the associated applications based on typically curing requirements.
Yep, totally agree. That makes sense. That's another way to do it.
How actively involved is the City of Toronto with the designers as these standards are evolving?
I mean, like it's up to like not really that active. Like I feel like all the designers haven't had too many challenges when it comes to concrete and what they're using for their projects. So it's been pretty hands off. It just depends on whatever is spec'd as part of the project. Usually whatever is spec'd can be delivered.
Okay. Another question or comment. Finally, the wood, I would say that reduction in concrete topping over the CLT panels could be reviewed and reduced. I believe the sound isolation pad between the concrete topping and the CLT has a fairly high emissions intensity. Better performing mats are being developed. Scott apologizes for the comments, but I think it's all very helpful. Any comments on that?
No, that makes sense too. Agree.
Yeah. I mean, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for input from the industry to help us understand better what alternatives are available, what is the most efficient way to move towards the targets that you have. And I really like the idea that you're going to have your case study so people can look at it and say, hey, I've got to meet a tier 2 objective by this point in time. What might get me there? Another comment we have here, our question, is there a minimal number of EV chargers required to be installed for new buildings, or is it only the energized outlet?
Not sure about the EV chargers, to be honest. It's a different part of the Toronto Green Standard.
If you're curious about the EV chargers, on our website there's a person who deals with our EV strategy. You can check that as well. Or if you send us an email, either myself or Zach, we can find out an answer for you on that.
Excellent. Regarding the parking, that's very tricky. We try to meet the carbon reduction goals, but at the same time, we increase the traffic. The more time to find parking, the worse the traffic. Also, the air pollution gets worse and the stress is higher for the residents.
Yeah, there's no perfect solution to this. Like, it's definitely going to have to be an optimization. I wasn't saying that, build no parking, because, sometimes it is required depending on the building use and where it is and all that kind of stuff. But to reduce it, even just by a little bit, could result in huge reductions in embodied carbon. So it's definitely an optimization, and there's definitely trade-offs. So it really just depends.
Is that not also tied in with the the work that's happening with all the transit systems, that they're trying to encourage the public to use the transit systems? Is that all tied in together as the goals and objectives?
Of course, yeah. Hopefully the transit options become better. Like, I don't blame people for not taking transit in a lot of cases right now, but yeah, hopefully it gets better and more people can get on transit and out of cars.
So another comment, if I understand this correctly, the city has an expectation that existing privately owned buildings will meet new requirements. Realistically, how would you force this on existing building owners, such as a condominium corporation board?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and yes, the idea is we need to reduce all the operational carbon that is in all of the buildings in the city of Toronto together. Now, the best way and the most efficient way to do that is, as your renewal projects come up, that's when you make the change. As your heating and cooling system is reaching its end of life, that's how you make the change. As you do renewals to your building envelope, that's how you make the change. Like, if your balconies need redoing, that's how you can do it there, because the incremental cost on top of that is actually quite small compared to ripping something out that has a long useful life. In terms of, so we are really promoting people doing that as part of their state of good repair or their renewal projects. And that's part of having these conversations. Let's get the conversations out there so that when people are doing their capital plans for a condo or for anything like that, they know what is going to be required down the line. In terms of forcing thing or enforcement, in our reporting bylaw, there is two pieces that could be seen as that. One is a fine. There is room for fines to be levied if you do not comply. And then the second piece is we are looking to have disclosure. So disclosing which buildings are reporting, disclosing which buildings are reporting which numbers, and people can make decisions. I know from a corporate standpoint, if they're looking at office buildings, organizations are now looking for lower carbon buildings because their corporate goals are a certain a certain level, and they have to hit these corporate goals, and a lot of that would be in their real estate, what they lease, what they rent. So if they are leasing a lower carbon building, it lowers their carbon as an organization and helps them hit those goals. So I think the requirement comes from also there's a demand for it and there's people looking for that. But yes, existing buildings, that's most of our carbon in the city is buildings that are already built. So yeah, there will be requirements on that.
So recognizing that we are a construction association, what do these regulations mean for contractors and construction companies that are working in the city of Toronto?
I can start quickly on that, Zach. That's a good question. I think it's an expansion of work. There's going to be a ton of work that has to be done in the city of Toronto in the next 20, 30 years. And I think that is good for business, for construction companies and contractors that are looking to do this work. I think the key part would just be staying on top of what the regulations are and what's coming, at least from the existing building side, so you can be a little bit ahead of the game and you can be knowledgeable for your customers.
Do you have anything to add to that, Zach?
Yeah. So, like, what that means for the industry, what the Toronto Green Standard and how it's set out means for the industry is that, like, we're moving towards, a situation where all new buildings will have to be designed and operated to near zero emissions, which means we're moving away from natural gas and electrifying all our HVAC and our domestic hot water systems in order to meet those future minimums of the Toronto Green Standard. So anything associated with those changes from a construction standpoint will need to be figured out as we get closer to 2030.
So what skills should the construction companies be hiring, or younger people, what should they be looking at developing? What skills?
I know from our end it's the skills that are needed for low carbon construction. So working with different materials than what have typically been in the past, working with different heating and cooling systems than just your standard fossil fuel burning heating system, and figuring out different ways to get that building to low carbon. So I think there's a lot of room in looking at the building envelope. There's a lot of room in the modeling piece of it. There's a lot of room in taking, a digital twin of a building to say, hey, if I do this to it, how does that affect kind of all the other pieces of the building? I think there's different skills. I don't think they're totally separate from the traditional way of building. I think they just need to be tweaked to have a little more focus on what local laws and policies are coming.
Yeah, I agree with Duncan. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Zach. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say I agree with Duncan. Like, working with low carbon materials may require some additional different skills that have been required compared to what have been required in the past. And then when it comes to, like, again, agreeing with Duncan on the operational HVAC systems and as well as the domestic hot water systems, we're now dealing with electrical type equipment like air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. All of those kinds of technologies may require different skills that have been compared to those that have been required in the past. So, operationalizing those pieces of equipment might be a bit different than commissioning a new natural gas boiler, for example.
I was also going to add the importance of attention to detail when they're constructing in terms of the building envelope to ensure that any air leakage, the connection between the different materials, attention is paid to how they're joining the materials to ensure that they're not leaving any gaps anywhere. While on one hand, it's going to be important that the design will facilitate it. It's equally important that the individuals that are constructing the design follow through completely with the requirement. A couple more questions before we end this session, but how can an organization incorporate these policies into the planning process for a customer?
From an existing building standpoint, I think it's about also educating the customer. I mean, in my presentation, we had kind of partners in implementation, and I think by being that trusted expert, having the knowledge about what policies and mandatory pieces are coming down, you can advise the customer or the person that you're working with on, hey, these are coming. Maybe we should build a little different. Here, this is coming here. Let's put this new equipment in so that you don't have to change it out 5 years, 8 years down the line. And I really think that you can gain some trust with customers doing that by being knowledgeable about what's coming down the pike, and then how does that apply to their buildings to help them in the future.
So last question here is, are building owners and utility providers planning for this?
I mean, from our discussions with the utilities, so Toronto Hydro is absolutely pushing the IESO for capacity in this. They are planning for electrification. They are planning different pieces of their distribution network for electrification. We have had a bunch of different webinars with them and their key account managers to talk about these items, as well as they've created the Toronto Hydro's created a climate action group to take on the heavy lifting around that from an existing buildings point of view, because the existing infrastructure is there and they need to figure out how to manage that. How do you upgrade certain pieces? How do you go after that?
Anything to add, Zach?
No, agree with Duncan. I guess, yeah, I could just support what he said with based on conversations that I've been a part of with the IESO and Toronto Hydro. I know some colleagues within our division are doing a lot of work with Toronto Hydro in order to ensure that there is capacity that'll meet our needs based on our requirements in the future, and based on some conversations I've had with IESO, they've said that there will be the capacity in order to serve the needs of Toronto as our requirements come into place as time goes on.
Yeah, it will be interesting because as we really right now in Ontario have a summer peak of electricity usage, and as we electrify our heating, there'll become a winter peak as well. So the capacity is there to expand in the winter right now. It's just, how do we balance that grid? How do we balance the usage between summer, winter, night, day? All those pieces will that's above my brain level, to be honest. But how do we balance the grid? There are people making 4 times what I do who know a lot more that are planning for that.
Excellent. Well, here we've got, we want to say here, help us help you. Take a few minutes to participate in the TCA's recently released environmental survey. The more you tell us about what you want, the better we can help you develop plans to facilitate your needs. As demonstrated in today's presentation, it's clear that the net zero and energy reporting requirements are continually becoming more stringent. As this unprecedented movement progresses, we need to work together and share our experiences more than ever. Oops, sorry, just looking for the screen. So we'd like to thank our distinguished panel members today for a fantastic interactive presentation. And also, we'd like to thank our viewers for joining us in this discussion. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next session in the new year. Remember, the TCA Environmental Committee is always looking for industry leaders to join us in our efforts to keep our members informed as movement towards net zero unfolds. Let our members know who you are and what your company is doing by becoming a green ambassador, and better yet, become a member of the Environmental Committee. For anyone who hasn't received a copy of our survey, you can contact the email address above. Thank you. Thank you once again, Duncan, Zach, fantastic presentation.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, everyone.